In 1985, 121 people in South Dakota and Minnesota were struck with a mysterious illness. There had been only one outbreak like it, and the last time it happened, medical detectives couldn't figure out the cause. Valley Springs, South Dakota, a tiny farming community of about 800 people, not far from the Minnesota border. It's a community of farms and suburban professionals, many of whom work in the nearby city of Sioux Falls. People here are accustomed to hard work and the hard weather, and aren't the type to complain. So when some residents began suffering from irregular heart rhythms, fevers, weight loss, diarrhea, edginess, and mysterious aches and pains, they wondered if it was more than a coincidence.
I was just fidgety and nervous, and not all the time. I guess that's what threw you off. It had been that steady, you couldn't have put up with it.
Heart would be either, you feel your pulse and it's just pounding, you could feel your heart pounding, and you ached, your legs and arms hurt real bad.
I started getting chills, then I'd get hot flashes, then I couldn't eat, and I'd be nauseated. Everything was just happening really, really fast.
At first, doctors were confused about the symptoms. Jane Nettestad's doctor thought she was having a nervous breakdown and put her in the hospital.
I'd never, had any of this problem before with a mental problem. So he put me on a mood elevator, and about 8 hours later, my heart was 160 beats per minute. And I just knew I was going to have a heart attack. It felt like it was just flying out of my chest.
10 miles down the road in Laverne, Minnesota, the stories were the same. Tony Dispinet suffered heart symptoms too, and immediately went to the emergency room, certain he was having a heart attack.
Well, about 3 o'clock in the morning, approximately 3, I woke up with a tightness in my chest, it felt like somebody was sitting on it.
Tests revealed it wasn't a heart attack, but he spent 3 days in the hospital as doctors tried to find out the cause. Some of the local physicians thought it was the flu or a virus, but after weeks of suffering, the residents started to compare notes.
There were folks that were sick and had been sick for a long time, and a couple had gone close to death, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with them. And they didn't know if it was contagious, if it was something in the water.
And they were all feeling these same symptoms. And then they were hearing of other people that were feeling these same symptoms.
When Richard Jacobson went to his doctor, he was told that his thyroid was malfunctioning and was sent to the area's leading thyroid specialist. When Jacobson called the specialist, he had just one question.
Doc, can you tell me why there's 5 people in my small town with the same condition?
Dr. Michael McMillan has been a thyroid specialist in South Dakota for the past 30 years. At first he thought Jacobson was exaggerating, but just to make sure, he decided to do a little of his own investigating. He went to the local hospital and looked through the x-rays and medical records of some recent patients. He discovered something alarming. There had been an increase in the number of patients with thyroid-type complaints, but there was a problem. Because in every x-ray, the thyroids were perfectly normal. The thyroid is a small butterfly-shaped gland at the base of the neck, which produces hormones that control both metabolism and growth. An overactive thyroid floods the body with hormones, disrupting the entire nervous system, causing symptoms such as heart fluctuations, weight loss, diarrhea, nervousness, muscle aches and pains. Dr. McMillan searched the medical journals for clues, trying to find out what could be causing an outbreak of thyroid problems in the area.
And I came across a title that said, "First Ever Epidemic of Silent Thyroiditis, York, Nebraska." Well, York, Nebraska is about 120 miles south of here.
The outbreak in York, Nebraska happened just 1 year earlier. Residents complained of the same symptoms: heart problems, fevers, fatigue, loss of appetite, and weight loss. So many people were ill, it threatened the economy of the small farming community. Doctors from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta were called in to investigate. But just as they arrived, the outbreak of silent thyroiditis ended as mysteriously as it had begun. The residents recovered, and the cause of the York outbreak was never discovered. Dr. McMillan immediately called the CDC to let them know it was happening again.
Dr. Michael McMillan. I'm trying to get a hold of Dr. Dan Fishbein.
I knew that it was going to happen again because I knew the one thing we all admitted is even the people who thought it was a virus, we didn't know what virus, we didn't know what it was caused by. So I knew that was going to happen again, and so I was not quite expecting, but certainly was not surprised.
As the CDC prepared to investigate this outbreak, the number of cases was rising.
Even if it just spread to Sioux Falls with all the people here, let alone Minneapolis or Detroit or something, we would have a major medical catastrophe on our hands.
Investigators needed to find the cause of the outbreak before thousands were affected. In June of 1985, there were 50 cases of the mysterious thyroid outbreak concentrated in 2 nearby towns, Laverne, Minnesota, and Valley Springs, South Dakota. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta was called in to investigate.
Certainly one of the most puzzling things about the outbreak is we didn't know what it was due to, and this made it incredibly difficult. Was it in the air? Was it in the water? Was it in the food? There was just no way to know.
Investigators needed to know as much about the outbreak as possible. It was striking both men and women equally. All age groups were affected. There appeared to be no occupational association and no worksite or school clusters. Entire families were affected. Was it possible that the outbreak was being spread person to person? Everyone suspected of having the disease was given a blood test and interviewed about where or how they might have contracted it.
You talk to patients, and you hope that by doing unstructured interviews, you'll get some ideas.
One of the questions that I thought was kind of cute that the epidemiologist asked everybody was, what do you think causes this? And the most frequent response, there had been a lot of tornadoes in this area the year before. The most frequent response was, I guess those tornadoes stirred up some chemicals and that got into our water supply.
But in order to determine what was causing the outbreak, investigators first had to figure out what the problem was. Blood tests revealed that all of the victims had an excess of thyroid hormone in their system. In some cases, the levels were 8 and 10 times above normal. Tests of the drinking water did not reveal anything which could have caused the outbreak. Dr. Louis Braverman is the country's leading expert in thyroid diseases. He was asked to examine some of the sick patients in South Dakota.
We then went out to a small community called Beaver Creek, if I recall, and went into one household where there were 4 generations in the house who had all of the signs and symptoms of thyrotoxicosis, and none of them, from a 4-year-old child to an 85 or 90-year-old great-grandfather, had an enlarged thyroid.
Since the thyroid glands of these victims weren't enlarged, they had no idea what was causing these symptoms. In the past, enlarged thyroid glands were so common in this part of the country it was known as the goiter belt. A goiter is the term for an enlarged thyroid.
This part of the country is called the goiter belt because there was iodine deficiency here. There's no iodine in the soil, there's nobody eating seafood, and so people used to get large iodine-deficient goiters.
The condition was so common that in 1922, the Mayo brothers opened the Mayo Clinic in nearby Rochester, Minnesota, offering safe, affordable surgery to alleviate the huge number of thyroid problems in the region. Over the years, as diets improved, the thyroid problems went away. But this outbreak was different. All of the patients had normal thyroids, and for some patients, the condition was serious.
One of the cases was a patient I had seen in the intensive care unit here in the hospital. And it was an older lady whose heart had suddenly started beating irregularly, and she'd gone into heart failure.
To find out if this was indeed a virus, health officials decided to take throat and fecal specimens for analysis. But all of the tests were negative. Then Dr. McMillan noticed something interesting: the geographic location of many of the victims.
Here was a community of Valley Springs, and then 3 miles across the highway was the community of Garrettson, which was almost the same size. There were 9 people in Valley Springs with the disease and nobody in Garrettson with the disease. How could those two communities, what was the difference?
In fact, the epicenter of the outbreak was Luverne, Minnesota, and there were no cases west of Valley Springs. But that changed when a resident of Sioux Falls called Dr. McMillan to say that she was suffering from the thyroid disease. Her name, Rhonda Pesky. Her parents owned a grocery store in Valley Springs where she occasionally purchased her groceries. Dr. McMillan drove out to visit her parents, Larry and Margaret Long, and to take a look around their store. The Longs did not have thyrotoxicosis, but their daughter did. Dr. McMillan wanted to know why. When Dr. McMillan learned that the daughter of a grocery store owner developed thyroid toxicosis, yet her parents did not, he decided to investigate. The grocery store owned by Larry and Margaret Long had a specialty item: extra lean ground beef. Dr. McMillan asked the Longs how often they ate the ground beef themselves. They laughed and said, never. It was such a popular item, they were always sold out.
It was a great meat. It was running about 90% lean.
But the Longs said their daughter might have taken some with her on her last visit. On a hunch, McMillan took a sample for analysis. By now, there were more than 100 cases of the mysterious thyroid outbreak, and for some, the symptoms were troubling.
When I had that thyroid scan, a couple gals that work in the hospital, they thought I had cancer is what they told me. They told me this personally, that we thought you were dying of cancer because I looked so bad when I went in for this thyroid scan.
Then, of course, the world's greatest endocrinologists were called in, and we had, I remember the meeting with them, and we laid out all the data, told everything, and they sat there and shrugged their shoulders and said, we don't know what this is.
The only thing they knew was that patients had 8 or 10 times the normal amount of thyroid hormone in their bloodstream, causing heart problems, fatigue, muscle aches, and pain. Investigators finally got a break when they heard of an entire family with thyrotoxicosis. It was a large, extended family, all of whom had confirmed cases of the thyroid condition, all except one.
It must have been 8 or 10 people. We bled everybody in the family, did their blood tests, and everybody had elevated thyroid function tests except one person, and that was a teenager.
But how was the teenager different from the other family members who got sick? The father told investigators he worked at the local meatpacking plant and regularly brought ground beef home for his family. It was the same plant which supplied the Longs grocery store with their specialty hamburger, the extra lean ground beef. Samples of the hamburger were collected for analysis and taken to a local pathologist. Using a cryostat, a portion of the hamburger was frozen in a matter of seconds.
We convert the tissue really into a block of ice that makes the tissue firm enough that we can cut thin sections, stain them, look at them under the microscope, and make a diagnosis.
Under a microscope, the pathologist noticed something unusual, something not normally seen in ground beef. Bits of animal thyroid mixed into the ground meat. Animal thyroid contains extremely high levels of thyroid hormones. Was it possible that this was causing the outbreak of thyrotoxicosis in the two small communities? To find out, doctors conducted an experiment.
One can say, well, just because you find it in the hamburger, how do you know that when the people eat the hamburger that they're really absorbing the thyroid hormones? So our next step was to feed the ground beef from Minnesota to rats.
One group of rats were fed the raw hamburger collected in Minnesota. And for comparison, another group was fed raw burger purchased near the laboratory in Worcester, Massachusetts. The rats which ate the Minnesota burger exhibited all the signs of thyroid problems.
These rats were wild rats. I mean, they were very jittery, nervous, and this is compared to the rather tranquil, normal behavior of the rats fed the Worcester hamburger. So that there's no question that these rats were, if one could use the expression, clinically thyrotoxic.
But residents of Valley Springs and Luverne weren't eating raw hamburger, and cooking the meat usually kills all bacteria and microorganisms.
Most of us eat cooked hamburger. And as a matter of fact, people in the Midwest tend to cook their hamburgers much more so than we do in the Northeast.
Investigators' next step, to do some tests on humans. They also wanted to know how an entire family developed thyrotoxicosis, while their young son did not. When investigators from the CDC found a large extended family who all suffered from thyroid problems except their young son, they wanted to know why. Interviews with the family revealed that the boy didn't eat meat, except for an occasional pepperoni pizza.
I hate meat. I like this.
Oh, and he's my son.
This was an important discovery. The next step, to confirm that the tainted hamburger created elevated thyroid hormone levels in humans as it did with the rats, even after it was cooked.
So that we did obtain 4 young physicians to participate in the study. And what we did was essentially bring them in the morning, fasting, drew their blood, and fed them an extremely well-cooked half-pound hamburger, which they enjoyed immensely since it was smothered in onions and on toast, so that it was a very tasty breakfast.
The meat used in the experiment was the same that was sold in the local stores. It came from this local slaughtering house in Luverne, Minnesota. But how was the local meat being contaminated? Public health officials inspected the local meatpacking plant and learned something interesting. The plant had been a kosher killing plant up until a few years earlier.
When animals are killed kosher, they're actually bled to death. And the thyroid gland, it has a real intense blood supply, and it's really red, except that if you bled the animal to death, then it would look white and it would look completely different.
And when the thyroid gland changed color, it was easier for the butcher to see and remove. The animal thyroid was then sold to drug companies.
All of the meatpacking companies would carefully dissect the thyroids out and sell them to the drug companies so they could make thyroid extract to treat other people.
But 2 things happened. First, this meat plant discontinued its kosher killing production, and with the development of synthetic hormones, drug companies no longer purchased the animal thyroids from slaughterhouses. The result? Since the animal thyroid wasn't sold to the drug companies, it was included along with the rest of the neck trim from the animal's gullet, and inadvertently passed along for human consumption.
And the gullet basically is this part of the cow's neck. And the muscles that are trimmed, that are low fat, are these muscles here, the sternocleidomastoid muscles on humans. The thyroid gland sits right under those muscles. And if someone is not paying attention as they're trimming, it's very easy to clip off a bit of thyroid gland as they take off the muscle.
When the animal's thyroid gland was mixed in with other ground meat for hamburger, it caused the highly elevated levels of thyroid hormones in those who ate it. The meat plant was producing the equivalent of 3,600 hamburger patties each day. But as soon as the problem was discovered, they immediately recalled the beef and instituted safeguards to prevent the problem from recurring.
Well, it was almost like the eureka type thing. We were really quite thrilled. We thought that we had, at that point in time, discovered the cause of this epidemic. And it was something relatively simple.
A simple solution to a complicated problem. After 7 months of investigation, the cause of the outbreak was finally discovered. And investigators believe that the tainted meat also was the cause of the outbreak in York, Nebraska, the year before. Shortly after this outbreak, the U.S. Department of Agriculture instituted strict guidelines for the trimming of meat from neck muscles and declared the thyroid gland was to be considered unfit for human consumption. But the residents of Valley Springs and Luverne don't care much about their place in medical history. And they aren't the type to hold a grudge. 121 residents developed thyrotoxicosis, and all recovered. Fortunately, there were no fatalities.
It's become one of CDC's major teaching cases because it illustrates all sorts of things that are really not usually encountered, but are very important lessons for young epidemiologists.
The outbreak was halted promptly, thanks to skill, intuition, and a little bit of luck. All are important ingredients in a successful medical investigation. For 18 years, a mass murderer successfully eluded the FBI. He was wanted for the murder of his entire family. This is how art and science led to his capture. The List family lived in this large Victorian home in the quiet, affluent town of Westfield, New Jersey. John List was a 46-year-old accountant. He and his wife, Helen, had been married for almost 20 years. They had 3 children, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John, and 13-year-old Freddie. John List's elderly mother, Alma, also lived with the family in her own separate apartment on the 3rd floor. The List children attended local schools and were all active and popular. John List was a devout Lutheran and taught Sunday school. In the fall of 1971, the List house stood empty, The family was away visiting a sick relative, but when a month went by with no signs of activity, neighbors grew suspicious and decided to call the police.
They felt that something was wrong and they asked us to check the house, which we did.
When police arrived, they entered the house through an unlocked window. The house was cold and there were no signs of activity, but they heard music.
Like a funeral dirge type music that was very disturbing to the officers who were in there.
The police also noticed the faint smell of decomposing flesh. They found the source in the ballroom. 4 bodies, each lying on a blood-soaked sleeping bag, lined up neatly, side by side. The victims were identified as Helen List and her 3 children. All had been shot to death at close range. Police noticed a blood trail on the floor, indicating that Helen and the children were shot in the kitchen, then dragged into the ballroom. In the kitchen, police found bags full of blood-soaked paper towels and a bloody mop, evidence that the killer cleaned up after the murders. Police searched the rest of the house. Upstairs, on the 3rd floor, they made another chilling discovery. A 5th body, 84-year-old Alma List. She had been shot in the head. In the den, police found 2 guns and a letter addressed to the pastor of the local church the List family attended.
I know that what has been done is wrong. I'm sure many will say, how can anyone do such a horrible thing? Mother is in the hallway in the attic. She was too heavy to move.
The letter was not only a confession, but an explanation. It was signed by John List. List had recently lost a lucrative banking job, was having money problems, and feared his family would have to go on welfare. And he had other concerns. As a devout Christian, List feared his family was turning away from a Christian life and would eventually stop going to church. He disapproved of his daughter's growing interest in an acting career, a profession he considered to be immoral. In the mind of John List, there was only one place he could send his family to save their souls.
At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now.
The letter provided some details of the murders.
John!
That it took longer for his oldest son, John, to die. He was riveted with bullets until List was satisfied the child was dead.
John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer.
John List's confession also described his last moments alone with his family.
I said some prayers for them all, from the hymn book. That was the least I could do.
When news of the murders broke, neighbors told police that the mild-mannered accountant was an odd, reclusive man with very few friends. 2 days after the bodies were discovered, police found List's abandoned car in a parking lot at JFK Airport in New York. The date on the parking voucher was November 10th, but there was no evidence List had taken a flight. But police knew, wherever List was, he had a 1-month head start. The manhunt for a mass murderer had begun. Police issued a nationwide murder warrant for the arrest of John Emil List. He was wanted for the murder of his entire family.
It was a high priority case. It was sent to every FBI field office, every post office, and to other law enforcement agencies across the country.
A ballistics report confirmed that the 2 guns found in John List's desk were the weapons used to kill his family. Autopsies revealed that the victims had been shot in the head. The victims had been dead about a month when their bodies were discovered. But where was John List?
There had been 2 schools of thought. One was that he had committed suicide after committing the homicides, and the other was that he was living somewhere out and around the Midwest.
Once in a while you'd get a sighting, a List sighting. You'd get a report that they saw a guy in, Alabama who looked like John List, because the FBI kept, information.
John Emil List would elude authorities for 18 frustrating years. despite efforts by investigators to keep the murder case alive through the media.
We would call the newspapers and we would insist that they keep it alive on the 5th anniversary, the 6th anniversary, the 15th anniversary. We kept it alive.
Then detectives had an idea.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
The television show America's Most Wanted has led to the capture of some of the FBI's most celebrated fugitives by generating phone tips from viewers.
One night watching TV, we watched America's Most Wanted, and I thought this might be a very interesting case for him to take on.
If we were successful in getting the List case aired, someone out there would recognize him and would make that telephone call.
Detectives convinced America's Most Wanted to do an episode on the John List murders, despite the fact that the case was almost 2 decades old.
I said, this is a guy I'd like to see caught, and we decided to do John List.
But there was a problem. At the end of each episode, viewers see a photograph of the wanted person, but the most recent photo of John List had been taken years before the murders. What would he look like almost 20 years later? The John List murder case would now enter the highly specialized world of forensic sculpting.
I had been involved in the battle for missing children's rights for years since the murder of my son in 1981, and I had come across Frank Bender over the years as a renowned forensic reconstruction artist.
Forensic sculptor Frank Bender reconstructs faces to help police track down aging fugitives or identify decomposed bodies. Part art, part science, part intuition. This is the skull of an unidentified individual police found in a field. To make an identification, they would need to see her face.
I work with physical anthropologists, I work with odontologists, forensic dentists in other words, pathologists, detectives.
When going from skull to face, Bender refers to special charts that measure facial tissue thickness based on race, age, and gender. Using these measurements as guidelines, Bender calculates the proper thickness of the skin in order to mold the shape of the face with his clay.
More important than the facial tissue thickness is paying attention to the forms in the skull, the nuances, the differences, the asymmetry. What makes this skull different from the others? And they're all different.
Bender then makes a fiberglass bust from the mold. On the right, Bender's forensic bust of the skull found in the field. On the left is a photograph of a teenage girl who had been missing and was then identified from Frank Bender's bust. Bender's extraordinary talent to put faces on the dead would now be applied to the living, an aging mass murderer. America's Most Wanted asked Frank Bender to add 18 years to the face of John List. The stage was now set to pump new life into an old murder case. This is John List in 1971. Frank Bender's job was to figure out what he would look like 18 years later. All he had to work with were some old photographs. Computers can age a face, but Bender's old-fashioned hands-on technique gives the forensic bust a personal touch.
A lot of these computers nowadays will just add like 5 wrinkles because they're 8 years older. Well, sometimes you could actually look better after a few years if you took care of yourself.
To look at John List, the individual, Bender needed a psychological profile of the killer.
I get into the head of the person. In a sense, I want to become that person while I'm working on the fugitive. I want to feel like that person. I want to know everything about that person.
He called on the help of forensic psychologist Richard Walter. Together, sculptor and psychologist would predict how John List would age. Bender and Walter pored over newspaper articles and photographs to analyze the man behind the murders. They researched his strict upbringing by German parents.
The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want.
The Lutheran Church had been a focus of young John's life. He was an only child and the son of an overly protective, domineering mother. List had a master's degree in accounting, but lacked social skills and had a history of losing jobs. The psychological profile revealed a man who killed out of anger and retaliation because of his own failure.
The perpetrator has a history of frustration and feeling entrapped by women, generally women of their own age group or older, or women in authority.
The psychological profile helped reinforce Bender's vision of the aging fugitive.
I had his mouth going down on the corners because of anxiety that I felt he carried with him from committing these crimes. And Richard brought out that it wasn't guilt from killing his family, but the anxiety of the fear of being caught.
Bender also took into account genetics. He looked at photographs of John List's parents and added sagging jowls and a receding hairline to the bust. List had a surgical scar behind his right ear, and Bender researched how the scar would look as he aged. With the fiberglass bust complete, Bender painted the skin and hair and put List in a suit and tie, what he and Walter thought List would wear most of the time. But the bust wasn't complete. The final touch would be a pair of glasses. Walter was certain List wasn't vain enough to wear contact lenses, and Bender predicted List would be wearing a different style of glasses than those he wore at age 46. Bender was convinced List would want to hide the fact that he was a failure by wearing glasses with dark, thick frames.
To look more intelligent, more important than he really was, and this was through the help of Richard Walter's profile.
Bender looked through dozens of pairs of used glasses and found the perfect pair to use on the bust. The painted face with the down-turned mouth, sagging jowls, receding hairline, and aging scar now looked out from behind dark, thick frames. The forensic bust was complete.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
Now tonight's first case, the oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
On Sunday night, May 21st, 1989, America's Most Wanted aired the episode on the List murders.
From this angle, notice
in Denver, Colorado, a family recognized the face of a mass murderer.
If you know anything about John List, call
the night America's Most Wanted revealed the forensic bust of John List, Wanda Flannery and her daughter were watching from their home in Denver, Colorado. Much to their horror, they saw a striking resemblance between John List and a former neighbor.
And it just all started adding up gradually. That he was an accountant and a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his ear, and that he was well put together and a classy dresser. And by the time they got to the sculpture, I was convinced it was him.
To look at it, you would have known.
And the clincher for me was the glasses and the jowls.
We said, oh my God, that's Bob, and Bob Clark.
Bob is John List. We've got to call.
Wanda Flannery told the FBI that her former neighbor recently moved to Richmond, Virginia, and was using the name Bob Clark. The FBI closed in, and agents arrested Robert Peter Clark at the accounting office where he worked in Richmond.
I approached him and I asked him, I said, "Are you Mr. Clark?" And he said, "Yes." And then I said, "Are you John List?" And he says, "No, I'm Robert P. Clark."
But Bob Clark had a scar behind his right ear, and a fingerprint check matched prints on a gun permit application John List had filled out 1 month before the murders. Bob Clark and John List were the same man.
I said, they got him. That was it. They got him.
Amazingly, John List wore the same style glasses that Frank Bender had used on the forensic bust.
Frank Bender was 100% right. The picture of John List, when he was captured, was put next to the picture of that bust on the front page of the New York Times. John List had the same exact glasses on that Frank Bender had put on the forensic bust. It was uncanny.
It was almost as though the person who did the bust had actually been looking at John List when he did it.
At John List's trial, the story unfolded of how the mild-mannered, church-going accountant meticulously planned the brutal execution of his entire family. List had lost his job, buckling under the strain of mounting bills and the perceived moral decay of his family. John List made a decision.
He decided he wanted to do this, and this was the only way out. This was the way for him to start with a clean slate, and that's why he did it.
After the children left for school, John List put his plan in motion. He shot his wife in the head at point-blank range. He then climbed 2 flights of stairs and entered his mother's apartment. He left his mother's body upstairs, but placed his wife's body on a sleeping bag and dragged it to the ballroom. He then cleaned up the blood. Later that afternoon, as the children arrived home, he murdered each one. The oldest boy, John, put up a struggle, and List fired 10 times. He dragged the children's bodies to the ballroom, lined them up on sleeping bags next to their mother, and cleaned up more blood. The List family morgue was now complete. With the executions over, List said a prayer, then wrote the letter to his pastor, confessing to the murders. He lowered the thermostat to slow the body's decomposition, turned on the radio to a classical music station, and began his life as a fugitive. Before the bodies were even discovered, List made his way to Denver, applied for a new Social Security number as Robert Peter Clark. In time, he made friends with his neighbor Wanda Flannery, rejoined the Lutheran Church, and married Wanda's friend, Dolores Miller. His new wife never suspected a thing. List told her his first wife had died of cancer and that he had no children.
I do not believe it. I love my husband very deeply. I do not believe this is the same man.
The couple eventually moved back east to the Richmond, Virginia area, where List found an accounting job. Richard Walter's psychological profile accurately predicted almost every aspect of John List's flight from justice.
What was he doing when they caught him? He was a CPA. He was still a volunteer in the Lutheran Church. A guy that kills his own mother, kills his own wife and his 3 kids, is still volunteering in the Lutheran Church. He was still the same creature that he was when he killed those people 18 years before.
Nearly 20 years after the brutal murder of his entire family, a jury found John List guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison.
John Emil List will be eternally synonymous with concepts of selfishness, horror, and evil. He is a man who could coldly, calculatingly, and cunningly conceive and carry out a cowardly plan to assassinate each of his 3 children.
I was just thrilled that the merger then between psychology and sculpture worked.
It was an invaluable tool in making a determination of how the guy would probably look, and it was just uncanny as to how close the sculpture was to the actual man.
I really paid attention to, I think, as much information as I had about John List and what he was about.
I truly believe if it wasn't for Frank Bender, John List would still be at large. But finally, we brought John List to justice.
Encounter. The crime committed that night might have gone unsolved had it not been for a common thread. One Sunday afternoon, two boys were playing together on an abandoned highway.
Ready? 3, 2, 1.
As they ran through a field chasing a parachute, they discovered a horrible sight. The nude, decomposed body of a young woman. She was lying face down, with her hands bound behind her back. A cord was wrapped 3 times around her neck like a leash. Under her body lay a white silk scarf tied in a knot.
This killer was trying to make a statement. He could have killed this woman with a lot less trauma. But the deepness of this bruise, the prominence of this bruise, indicated that he applied a lot more force than it was necessary to end this woman's life. He was violent.
The victim was identified as 20-year-old Lana Long, an exotic dancer who worked at the Sly Fox Lounge in Tampa. Detectives found some faint tire tracks near the body, but little else. Homicide investigators interviewed Lana Long's boyfriend, John Corcoran. Corcoran hadn't reported Long missing, even though they lived together, and he hadn't seen her for 3 days.
He had an explanation of why he didn't report her missing. It was kind of vague. We were concerned about that.
Corcoran admitted that he argued with Long on the day of her disappearance about the number of men who were calling her at home, asking her out on dates. 2 weeks later, a second body was discovered in a deserted location.
I can vividly recall getting in the car, driving to the crime scene, saying to myself, please don't let her be bound. Please don't let her be tied up. It felt like a ton of bricks had just fallen upon me. Because here we go from rarely having a victim bound to now 2 within 2 weeks of each other.
The victim was identified as 22-year-old Michelle Sims, a former beauty contestant who had turned to prostitution to support a drug habit. Near the body, police discovered some fresh tire prints in the soft sand, but there was something unusual about the tire impressions. The vehicle had 3 different tires. Detectives made plaster molds of the tire impressions for analysis, hoping they would provide some clue to the identity of the murderer. Because of the similarities in these 2 cases, investigators believed that both murders were committed by the same person. This time, however, John Corcoran had an alibi and was no longer considered a suspect. In the forensics lab, when Michelle Sims' clothing was analyzed, they discovered a tiny clue, a mysterious red fiber. It was similar to a red fiber discovered at the Lana Long crime scene on the white silk scarf found under Long's body. On September 18, 1984, the nude body of a 3rd woman was discovered. The victim, 18-year-old Chanel Williams, who had a prior arrest for prostitution.
This particular case, it was a black female. Her body had been dumped on the roadside. She was completely nude. She was not bound in any way. There was some clothing found next to her, tied in a knot. She had suffered a gunshot wound to the back of the head. So when you look at this case, it's totally different than the other cases, or is it?
The forensics lab found the answer. Tiny red fibers were discovered on William's clothing, fibers similar to those found on the other two victims. While detectives launched a full-scale investigation, they hoped that these mysterious red fibers would lead them to their serial killer before he struck again. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department wanted to know all they could about the mysterious red fibers found on the three murdered women. Each of the tiny fibers was microscopically analyzed and compared. Under a scanning electron microscope, magnified more than 1,000 times, scientists noticed an unusual size and shape to the fibers.
Instead of being round or square, the fiber looks more or less triangular, but like a triangle, it's been pinched so that you see the three legs sticking out from the core of the fiber.
The fibers from the three women were all triangular or trilobal. The next task was to identify whether the fibers were natural or man-made. Since man-made fibers are made from chemicals, scientists use what is called a melting point apparatus to determine the temperature at which the fiber would break down. The results revealed that the red fibers were nylon. And by microscopically measuring the light reflected through the fibers, scientists determined that all three trilobal nylon fibers were dyed the exact same color and were from the same dye lot. The conclusion: the red nylon trilobal fibers found on the three victims were all from the same source. Nylon trilobal fiber is used mostly in carpet, high durability, inexpensive carpet. Since this fiber masks dirt, it's often used in automobiles and hotels. Next, homicide detectives turned their attention to the tire impressions found near the bodies. Tire tread experts noticed that there were 3 different tires on the vehicle. The impression of the front tire was simple to identify. It was an extremely common model made by the Goodyear Tire Company. The right rear tire was manufactured by the Goodyear Company as well. It was a low-priced model called the Viva. But there was something unusual about the tread. It was a white wall tire and was on the rim with the white wall side facing inward. The left rear tire could not immediately be identified since it was not among the thousands of known tire treads in the FBI's computer database. So investigators sent the tire impression to the Goodyear Tire Company in Akron, Ohio, to see if they could help identify it. Goodyear's tire expert recognized that it was a specialty tire and a very expensive one, not sold in retail stores. It was a model called the Vogue, made by the Vogue Tire and Rubber Company, and was used exclusively on Cadillacs. The tire impression showed that it too was a white wall tire, which was placed on the vehicle with the white wall side facing inward. If the detectives could find the vehicle with this unusual combination of tire treads, they would have the vehicle which left the tire tracks at 2 of the murder scenes. They also suspected that this vehicle would have red nylon trilobal carpet. Gary Terry decided not to release this important information to the press.
Serial killers watch the news, read the newspaper just like anybody else. We were aware of the experience up in Atlanta, Georgia with the Wayne Williams case. I had personally talked with the investigators up there. He changed his pattern after he saw it described in the newspaper. He began reading about trace evidence. So he began dumping the bodies in the rivers to wash the bodies and destroy latent or trace evidence.
Deputies believed that the killer was cruising for victims along Nebraska Avenue, where prostitutes usually congregate. Female police decoys walked the strip dressed as prostitutes in an attempt to lure the killer. The number of patrol cars in the area also was increased. Author Anna Flowers described the search for the killer in her book, Bound to Die.
I've talked to a lot of officers who say, I have to think like the killer in order to catch him. I worry, what would it take for me to become the killer? Interesting thought.
Despite police efforts, a fourth nude body was discovered in a deserted area. The victim, 28-year-old Karen Din's friend, who had turned to prostitution to support a drug habit. Deputies knew that the serial murderer had struck again when they found red nylon trilobal fibers in Din's friend's clothing.
The pattern that we saw here, the way that these bodies were left, the way that they were strangled, the way that they were tied, indicated that we had a serial killer.
Despite leaving behind the fiber and tire track evidence, the killer was smart. But his next target, a 17-year-old girl, outsmarted him. 2:30 a.m. After working the night shift at this donut shop in Tampa, Florida, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh rode her bicycle home along a dark, deserted street. Suddenly, a man jumped from behind a parked van, knocked Lisa off her bicycle, grabbed her by the hair, and forced her into his car.
God, help me. I was thinking I was going to be killed. Oh my God, just help me.
He drove McVeigh to an apartment. Over the next 24 hours, she was repeatedly raped and sodomized, blindfolded, petrified, and convinced she would die. Lisa McVeigh made an important decision.
I had the life of God in me. I had the willingness to live, to survive. That's it, the survival part. When you're in something like that, you would be surprised yourself what you're capable of.
While still blindfolded, McVeigh was permitted to use the bathroom. She left her fingerprints everywhere she could, under the toilet seat, around the sink, on the hairdryer.
If I had died, if I was killed, I want them, as far as the police or whoever found me, to know that I was there and I tried.
Lisa was a very sharp young lady. I personally feel what saved her life was her actions, and those actions were to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to every demand.
Red carpet. Her abductor stopped the car for a few minutes, and Lisa heard a familiar sound. A 24-hour bank teller machine.
I heard the sounds of the keys, of the buttons on the machine.
A short drive later, he stopped the car, opened the door, put Lisa on the street along with her clothes, warned her not to remove the blindfold for another 5 minutes, and drove away.
Freedom. Wow, I'm alive, I'm here, what do I do now? I looked both ways, and I fell to my knees and I started crying.
Lisa McVeigh was taken to the hospital and her clothing sent to the forensic lab for analysis. But before it could be analyzed, detectives were called to another homicide. Another nude body found near a highway overpass.
And you could tell it was him. There were actually no ligatures on the body, but you could see ligature marks where he had removed the ligatures.
When the forensic lab analyzed the clothing from Kim Swan and Lisa McVeigh, they discovered a shocking piece of information. Kim Swan's clothing contained the same red nylon trilobal fibers as the other victims, And the same red fibers were found on Lisa McVeigh's clothing.
It was disbelief. We couldn't believe that we have, for some reason, the killer has not killed. He's let a victim survive.
Lisa McVeigh's courage and determination made her the first known survivor of the serial killer. Could she provide enough information to find him? When police realized that Lisa McVeigh's rapist was the serial killer, the clues she provided took on a new importance. She saw the word Magnum on the dashboard of his car. Only one car had the word Magnum on the dashboard, the 1978 Dodge Magnum. A computer search of Dodge Magnum owners in the area revealed a list of 486 names. McVeigh also told investigators that her abductor used a 24-hour bank teller machine shortly before she was released. When the records of all bank machine transactions for November 4th were compared with the list of Dodge Magnum owners, only one name was on both lists: Robert Long. Robert Bobby Joe Long was a 31-year-old part-time X-ray technician. Separated from his wife, he was the father of 2 children. Since Lisa McVeigh was blindfolded during most of her captivity, she could not positively identify him from photographs. So Bobby Joe Long was immediately placed under 24-hour surveillance. Long was followed to this movie theater, and when he went inside, deputies inspected the tires on his car. On the right rear side was a Goodyear Viva. On the left rear side, the expensive specialty tire, the Vogue. Both tires were inverted, with the white wall side facing inwards. They were the same tires and in the same position as the tire impressions found at 2 of the murder sites. When Long walked out of the movie theater, deputies immediately arrested him and confiscated his car for further analysis. The tire treads matched the plaster impressions taken from 2 of the crime scenes. Long's blood type matched a semen stain found on one of the victims, but it was the carpet inside the Dodge Magnum that linked Long to all of these crimes. The red nylon tri-lobal carpet fibers inside Long's Dodge Magnum matched the fibers found on the murdered women. And they also matched the red fibers on Lisa McVeigh's clothing.
How was he getting so much fiber evidence on the clothing of the victims? Well, he was stripping his victims down in the car, and he was throwing the clothes in the floorboard of his vehicle. And the victim was kicking the clothing, kicking it. It was picking up the fiber evidence out of the floorboard of his vehicle. Fiber evidence is often referred to as a silent witness. It doesn't say a thing, but it just speaks volumes.
When told of this evidence against him, Bobby Joe Long confessed to the rape and abduction of Lisa McVeigh as well as the murders. He also confessed to 2 additional murders the police knew nothing about and led them to the bodies. In all, he confessed to 10 murders.
It's sad what happened to him, and that I could do something like that to somebody. All the victims, all of them, you know, and you're talking about a lot of them, a lot. A lot of lives just gone right down the tubes because of me, you know, in one way or another. And it's not a good feeling. It's not a pleasant feeling. I'm not proud of anything I've done. And the worst thing is I don't understand why. I don't understand why.
Yes, it was bad. Yes, it was very traumatic to my life, but it's made me who I am today. The challenges in my life, the weaknesses that I had then, has made me a stronger, better person today. And that's how I'm able to survive.
I'm a firm believer that this is not all the homicides Bobby Joe Long did. You don't start killing the way Bobby Joe Long started killing. Have we found all the victims? No. Are we going to find all the victims? I doubt it. not unless someday he decides to give us the rest of the information and the rest of the story.
Derek Severs and his wife Eileen, who are in their 60s,
half away from the home of Derek and Eileen Severs, who disappeared about 3 weeks ago.
Resume their search for Derek and Eileen Severs, who vanished without trace from their home in Hambleton.
Despite a detailed search for a missing couple by police and hundreds of volunteers, it was the information found in some dirt which led police to their whereabouts. Derek and Eileen Severs were a wealthy retired couple who lived a life of English leisure in Hambleton, a small village about a 2-hour drive from London. The village sits on a narrow peninsula that juts out into Rutland Water, one of Europe's largest man-made lakes. The woods and the lake make it a popular vacation destination, and the Severs had been living here for the past 20 years in a home known locally as the Bungalow. Derek Severs had been retired for the past few years and was well known and well liked among neighbors of the small village. Doug Clements lived next door to the Severs.
I'd never met a better man than Derek Severs. He liked a bit of horse racing and he loved a pint of beer.
Derek's wife Eileen was equally well known, not only as a volunteer for many local charities, but also as a kind and generous friend and neighbor.
Mrs. Severs was one of those people who spent all her time visiting people, doing things for charity. She was always seen, everybody liked her.
Saturday afternoon, November 13th, 1993, was the last time friends saw Derek Severs. He was having lunch and a few pints of ale here at the Finch's Arms pub. Friends said Derek left the pub around 3:30 that afternoon, got into his car, and was headed straight home. Eileen Severs was last seen on that same afternoon. She left this church after attending a charity bazaar she helped organize. Eileen told friends she too was headed home. 5 days later, after the Severs both missed some previously scheduled appointments, friends called the police.
This is the sort of place where if you're missing for a couple of hours, people want to know why.
Police immediately drove out to the Severs' home. The missing couple's 37-year-old son, Roger, answered the door.
Derek and Eileen Severs?
Well, Mum and Dad are on holiday in London.
Would you mind if I had a look around then?
Police took a quick look around the house.
Thank you.
There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign of anything wrong inside the house.
By which you mean there's no sign of a struggle or anything?
No, there's nothing at all.
But friends weren't convinced that everything was all right. The Severs had never gone away without first canceling their scheduled appointments.
It was not in their nature to go away without making arrangements to talk, telling people they were going away.
They weren't the sort of couple who would disappear without telling friends. They would always say, well, look, we're popping out, look after our house, because that's the sort of village that it was.
Derek, at times he did go away, he used to leave me in charge. He'd say, look after the garden.
And neighbors said it was unusual for Derek and Eileen Severs to ask their son Roger to house sit. Roger was a disappointment to his parents. He was unemployed and had the reputation of being a con man, once telling a girlfriend that he was a gynecologist. When police heard these stories, they decided to take a closer look around the Severs home. 6 days after friends last saw Derek and Eileen Severs, the police decided to make a second visit to the Severs home, this time in daylight. The officers noticed that the backyard had recently been excavated, and there were signs of a fire in the garden.
And looking through the windows, we could see this kitchen carpet was missing, but it didn't add up. So we decided that we'd use the police powers to go into the bungalow to have a further search.
Roger Severs told police that his parents left for London from the Peterborough train station. Police went to the train station, armed with a photograph of the Severs. They asked the employees and regular passengers if they had seen the couple.
Mr. Severs was this very big man who walked very badly with the aid of a stick, and we thought that if anybody had seen them, they would remember them.
But no one at the train station recalled seeing the Severs, and police found no evidence they even made it to London. Already local newspapers ran headlines about the Severs' mysterious disappearance. The police suspected foul play and decided to conduct a forensic search for blood inside the Severs' home. Detectives noticed some suspicious dark stains on the side of the bathtub and performed a Kastle-Meyer test. A damp cotton swab is used to wipe the stain, and then some phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide are added. The sample of the stain found on the bathtub turned a bright pink, a positive presumptive test for the presence of blood.
The fact we'd found blood didn't necessarily prove conclusively that it had come from a violent action. They could have, one of them could have cut themselves in the bathroom. Anything could have happened.
Police also noticed a blood smear on the back seat of Derek Severs' automobile, and the Kastle-Meyer test confirmed that stains on the garage door were indeed blood spatter. Police noticed something else that was suspicious. They found a large number of green fibers in the hallway inside the house, in the trunk of Mr. Severs' automobile, and on a pair of trousers believed to be Roger's. The fibers were an important clue because they did not match any items inside the house. This was an indication that the source of the fibers had recently been removed.
The actual item itself was missing, so that if as were the two Severs, Mr. and Mrs. Severs, so logic tells you that it's gone with the two, it's part of the crime scene.
The police were convinced that the Severs had been the victims of foul play and suspected that Roger Severs knew more about his parents' whereabouts than he was telling them. Investigators believed that Roger Severs was involved with his parents' disappearance, but they had no proof that a crime had been committed and had no hard evidence suggesting where their bodies might be. The search for the Severs began in their own backyard, since it appeared that the gardens had recently been excavated and there had also been some kind of fire.
You'd need a very, very big fire to dispose of bodies, and there's no way they could have been disposed of on there.
The police didn't find any human remains, but they did find small bits of carpet and clothing in the ashes.
It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, because all around there is rural. There's a huge expanse of water, lots of forests, trees, woods, open fields. How on earth do you find a body there?
Just when all of these searches turned up no clues, police finally got a break. They learned of a strange event which occurred before the Severs were even reported missing. A police officer on patrol recalled seeing a man in an isolated area called the Exton Avenue Woods.
Is there something wrong, sir?
The man matched Roger Severs' description.
I just needed to relieve myself, and then I decided to gather some leaf bulbs for the garden.
Well, then move along when you're ready.
We'll do so, officer. Good night.
The officer said the man acted suspiciously.
Well, any gardener, any horticulturist will tell you don't want leaf mould in November. It's not the time of the year you're going to collect it, and certainly not at 6:30 at night. So we assumed something had occurred up in the Exton Avenue Woods there, so off we went to have a look.
When they returned to the area a few days later, they found a bloody towel near the spot where the man was seen collecting leaves. But the police could find no evidence that the bodies were buried there.
We did a fingertip search of the entire area, and we never ever recovered any further evidence from that scene.
The towel matched those in the Severs house. But without blood samples for Mr. and Mrs. Severs, it was difficult to know to whom the blood belonged.
It was challenging rather than frustrating. We wanted to find the bodies for two reasons. One, evidential, obviously. And secondly, of course, I think it's only right and proper if there's been a murder, we want the bodies for the relatives and everyone else. It's only right that we should be able to find them.
Late one night, Inspector Palmer studied the photographs of the Severs automobile. As he flipped through the photographs, something unusual caught his eye. Something suspicious about the dirt and mud on Mr. Severs' car. The color of the mud just didn't look right.
This staining was a lot lighter in colour than you would expect from a vehicle on road usage. Generally speaking, a vehicle on road usage, it's a very dark, black, dark grey, dirty colour. This was a lot lighter colour.
Was it possible that an analysis of the dried mud on the car might give police some idea of where the car had been? To find out, detectives called in Dr. Tony Brown, a geologist at the University of Exeter. Dr. Brown began his examination by collecting the soil, dirt, grass, and debris from the wheel wells of Derek Severs' automobile. Under a microscope, Dr. Brown analyzed the samples and discovered tiny bits of vegetation mixed in with the mud, including minute pieces of moss, leaves, and grass. There was even a small piece of fishing line.
It told us that it was a mixed deciduous woodland, probably oak dominated, but with also several other species. It was clearly quite shady. The moss could only come from a little shaded woodland. And there was also a fair amount of grass. And at first that might seem to contradict the woodland, but that's likely to occur either at the edge of a clearing in a woodland or towards the edge of a woodland. And of course the fishing line suggested it was somewhere that fishermen parked.
And Dr. Brown discovered another microscopic clue. More than 20 different types of pollen were mixed in with the mud from the wheel well. Pollen is a fine powder-like material which is produced by trees and plant life. It functions as the male seed in fertilization. To identify the pollen, Dr. Brown needed to isolate the microscopic pollen granules from the soil. First, by using a series of filters, and then by adding hydrofluoric acid, a chemical so powerful it can dissolve glass. The acid dissolves away all remaining materials, leaving just the pollen. Dr. Brown was able to identify most of the pollen in the sample. Oak, elm, and pollen from hawthorns were easy to identify just by sight. However, he noticed one type of pollen he had never seen before.
I knew that I didn't know what it was. And then after that, of course, we run through the normal process of identifying an unknown pollen type.
There are millions of different species of pollen. Dr. Brown looked closely at the number and placement of the tiny slits and compared them to the thousands of photographs of pollen samples in his library. After looking through scores of samples, Dr. Brown found a match. The pollen was from an unusual specimen, from a tree not terribly common in England. It was pollen from a horse chestnut tree, a tree native to Asia.
In my whole career of looking at samples from the East Midlands, I'd never actually seen horse chestnut pollen from a sample.
And there was something else unusual about the pollen from the horse chestnut tree. It's a heavy pollen, and because of its weight, it's too heavy to travel far through the air. It tends to float straight down to the ground, very close to the tree itself. Since Dr. Brown found horse chestnut pollen in all 4 of the rover's wheel arches, he was convinced that the car had recently been parked near a horse chestnut tree. Police asked Dr. Brown to identify possible locations that had horse chestnut trees, as well as other vegetation matching the samples found in the Severs wheel wells. Dr. Brown identified 5 possible locations to search. The first woodland searched was this one, the closest to the Severs home, but an entire day of looking here turned up nothing. Next, they searched the second area Dr. Brown identified, a larger woodland near the lake. Specially trained search teams worked their way down this hill. When an officer poked a stick into one of the mounds, he found it to be unexpectedly soft. He cleared away some leaves and loose soil to reveal a patch of human skin. Police slowly uncovered the bodies of Eileen and Derek Severs. Ironically, they were found lying on a bed of horse chestnuts. Just a few feet away stood a horse chestnut tree.
They were lying side by side, and both of them were wrapped in green blankets.
Fibers in the green blanket matched the green fibers found in the Severs hallway and on the trousers that belonged to Roger Severs. The top layer of leaves and soil was similar to the soil found at the Exton Avenue woods, where Roger Severs had been seen by police. Another layer of soil matched the soil in the Severs' backyard. There was even a layer of roof tiles to stabilize the grave. The tiles matched the roof tiles on the Severs home.
Roger was then tied into every step of the progression from the murder to the burial.
All of the evidence pointed to the Severs' only son, Roger, who had a history of personal and financial difficulties.
He was basically penniless, certainly hard up, and we believe that he had turned up at the bungalow and maybe for the first time, we don't know, had been refused help by his parents.
What do you mean too much?
On Saturday afternoon, November 13th, while his father was at the pub, Roger argued with his mother in the kitchen. He followed her to the bathroom and attacked, striking her 8 times to the head, causing the blood spatter found on the bathtub. Roger then wrapped his mother's body in a green blanket, dragged her body to the kitchen, leaving a trail of green fibers found in the hallway and on Roger's trousers. Derek Severs arrived home shortly afterwards. And when he did, Roger was waiting. He struck his father 10 times in the head, causing the blood spatter onto the garage door. Roger placed his father's body into the back seat of the car, where police later noticed the blood smear, and he put his mother's body in the trunk, where green blanket fibers were later discovered. Roger drove his father's car to a deserted location in the woods, parked under a horse chestnut tree in an area used by fishermen, and then dragged the bodies into the woods. Roger wanted to limit the time he spent at the scene. So instead of digging a grave, he placed the bodies into a ravine and covered them with roofing tiles, fertilizer, and leaves. But the most important piece of evidence came as Roger was driving away. Pollen from the nearby horse chestnut tree flew up into the wheel wells of the automobile. Roger Severs could never have imagined that this pollen would lead police to his parents' grave. Roger Severs was charged in the murder of his parents, and during the trial took the witness stand and confessed. His plea for leniency failed, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
The wife and I, we lost two good friends, and life's never been the same since.
I embarked on something which I saw as being rather simplistic, link this vehicle with those man-made roads. That was all I wanted. I got a lot more, and hopefully that's going to help a lot of people, investigators in the future.
Well, I think that the police now are certainly far more aware of the value of what otherwise might just be described as mud.
I felt like I was in a war zone with the explosions, the smell of smoke, the smell of burning flesh, people screaming.
It was the single most deadly automobile accident in American history. 99 vehicles, most of them destroyed. 12 people died.
Identifiable?
Not at all.
More than 50 were injured.
Total destruction. If I hadn't been there and I witnessed it, I don't believe I could have believed.
The accident happened along a 3-mile stretch of highway long known for dense, thick fog. But what was causing the fog? The victims and their families wanted answers. The accident occurred on Interstate 75 in Tennessee, on a portion of highway between Chattanooga and Knoxville. The highway was constructed through a valley which lies between the Cumberland and Great Smoky Mountains. From the time the highway first opened back in 1973, there had been numerous multi-vehicle chain reaction accidents in the same 3-mile section. The first occurred just 4 months after the highway opened. 3 people died in a 17-car pileup. 10 were injured. Just 1 month later, there was a 9-car accident. Although there were no deaths, 9 were injured. During the first 6 years the highway was open, there was an average of 1 multi-car accident each year. One of the largest was in November of 1978, involving more than 60 vehicles. 6 people were killed, nearly 100 injured. All of the accidents had one thing in common: the sudden appearance of a dense, thick fog, reducing visibility to near zero. Tennessee State Highway officials responded by installing fog warning lights to warn drivers when fog was in the area. Highway patrol officers were posted to stand watch every morning along the fog-prone area to make sure drivers slowed down when the fog warning lights were activated. The combination of these 2 systems worked. For 11 years, there were no major accidents along the fog-prone stretch of Interstate 75. But all of that changed on December 11, 1990.
It's a massive wreck. Everybody's bumping into everybody. I've had several reports. I've had an explosion in that area, and they're still piling up.
As I rolled down the window, I could hear the cars just crashing into each other, one after another.
A motorhome hit the front end of my truck after just seconds after I had gotten out, and then vehicles started hitting the back of it. I'll never forget hearing one, and he hit other cars and just knocked them out of the way like there were nothing, and came and crashed just to the right of that motorhome. The explosion was such that it almost knocked me down.
Mike Curtis pulled this 14-year-old boy out of the motorhome, then rescued the boy's mother.
And I turned and went back to get her husband. All I could see was fire. I could smell hair burning. His coat came off burning in my hands. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever had to witness. The most helpless feeling I've ever had.
The man burned to death. 12 people were killed, 56 others injured, making it the largest vehicular accident in American history. These pictures were taken shortly after the accident, when most of the fog had dissipated.
The vehicles that I saw, I don't even know if you could classify them as vehicles. What normally was a pickup truck was 3 foot in length, body still in it.
After 11 years without a serious accident, the killer fog had struck again. But why? The families of the dead and injured demanded answers. They wanted to know what caused the dense, thick fog on December 11th, 1990. On December 11th, 1990, 30-year-old Craig Piper was driving his tractor-trailer south on Interstate 75, on his way to visit his mother for the holidays. When he entered the thick, dense fog, visibility was near zero. Within seconds, he crashed.
The flames were extremely tense, and I knew there wasn't any way I could get him out. And I had to stand there and watch this man burn in his vehicle. There wasn't really anything I could do. The flames were too big. I didn't have a fire extinguisher. I just had to stand there and watch this man burn alive.
Craig Piper's mother wanted answers and hired attorney Doug Fees, who was not only a lawyer but also an engineer. She wanted Fees to find out what caused the terrible fog that was responsible for her son's death.
She said the 2 people in that car were killed and that her son had been burned alive in his tractor trailer, and was wondering if there was anything that I could do to help her.
The accident occurred along Interstate 75 at its lowest point in the valley, about a half-mile from where the interstate crosses the Hiwassee River. Because of its location, fog has always been common in this area. Fog is basically a cloud which forms on the ground. Fog occurs when there is too much water in the air for the atmosphere to absorb. Since cooler air holds less moisture than warm air, and cool air gathers in low-lying areas, the valley through which Interstate 75 passes is perfect for the formation of natural fog. But the fog described by the accident victims was extremely thick and dense. Was the fog on the day of the accident naturally produced, or was it caused by one or more of the local industries nearby?
On those 3 days, there was some amount of river fog, although it was relatively small. On all 3 days, there was a very noticeable emission of fog-related water vapor from the Bowater facility.
The Bowater Paper Company is located 3 miles to the east of the interstate highway. It is the largest producer of newsprint in North America and releases large quantities of water vapor into the atmosphere 24 hours a day as part of the manufacturing process. Wayne Davis recommended that the state of Tennessee conduct a more detailed study in order to understand the cause of the fogging conditions. The state decided not to fund a more detailed study, but elected to install a fog warning system along the highway and posted state troopers to patrol the fog-prone stretch of highway each and every morning. For 11 years, the system worked. Between 1979 and 1990, there were no serious multi-vehicle accidents along the 3-mile stretch of Interstate 75. The system worked until December 11th, 1990. The Wayne Davis study was an important starting point for Doug Fees. But the Davis study was conducted 12 years earlier. Fees needed to know what caused the fog on December 11, 1990. Doug Fees heard about a scientist who was using computers to track weather conditions and pollutants. Was it possible that science could recreate the weather condition on the day of the accident? Attorney Doug Fees wanted to know if the thick, dense fog on the morning of the accident had been produced naturally or was caused by one or more of the local industries or some combination of both. To find out, he hired Dr. Alan Eschenroder, who teaches civil engineering at Harvard University. His area of expertise is risk management, and he also runs a consulting firm which specializes in air quality modeling. Eschenroder gathered weather information about the morning of the accident from the Knoxville and Chattanooga airports, as well as from 2 nuclear power plants, one only 18 miles from the scene. Weather records indicated that there were few, if any, clouds on the morning of the accident. Winds were light, and the temperature dropped rapidly the night before from a high of 60 degrees in the afternoon to almost freezing. This 30-degree drop in temperature could cause a weather phenomenon called an inversion. An inversion occurs when the temperature on the ground is cooler than the temperature in the atmosphere. This prevents air and moisture from dissipating into the atmosphere, pushing the moisture back towards the ground. Very early on the morning of the accident, a helicopter pilot flying over Interstate 75 noticed a mushroom-shaped cloud similar to this one over the Bowater paper mill smokestacks, 3 miles east of the accident site. Eschenroder believes this was visual confirmation of the inversion. Water vapor is produced naturally, coming from evaporation from lakes, streams, rivers, and ground moisture. Dr. Eschenroder calculated that the evaporation rate of the natural bodies of water in the area was only 392 gallons per day. This was barely enough to create even a light fog, let alone the dense, thick fog described by accident victims and rescue personnel. Eschenroder was convinced there had to be another source of water vapor which caused the thick fog. He noticed a series of ponds which straddled the interstate highway on 2 sides. These were wastewater treatment ponds which belonged to the Bowater paper plant. These ponds were used to clean the industrial wastewater from the paper mill. In 2 of the ponds, aerator fans would propel the water up into the air. Most of the water dropped back into the ponds. Some of it did not.
That's called drift. Drift droplets are things that drift away from the site of where they are formed. All the other droplets fall back to earth or fall back to the pond where they originate. So we had to do some original calculations in an engineering estimate fashion for emission of those droplets.
Eschenroder calculated that these wastewater treatment ponds added 10 million gallons of water vapor into the atmosphere in the 24 hours preceding the accident. Far more than the 392 gallons from the natural bodies of water. At the paper plant itself, an additional 1.5 million gallons of water vapor was being released each day from the smokestacks. But it wasn't just water vapor that was being released from these smokestacks. Paper plants released what are called particulates as waste from the paper production process. Particulates are microscopic particles which become surfaces on which water vapor can condense, and this leads to fog.
You not only had the fog potential from the presence of the water vapor, but you had a place for it to form in the surfaces of these microparticles, these condensation nuclei.
But how could Eschenroder tell if the water vapor from the Bowater paper plant 3 miles away caused the fog on the interstate highway on the day of the accident? He found part of the answer on this aerial videotape shot by a local videographer a few hours after the accident. Eschenroder recognized the wind pattern as a drainage flow which carries cooler air down into the valley. But Eschenroder needed to know in which direction the drainage flow was heading. To do that, he needed to know the exact position of the airplane. Using navigational charts, calculating the position of the sun from the glint angle off the wing and ground references, he identified the plane's position relative to the paper mill and the accident site. The videotape convinced Eschenroder that the drainage flow wind pattern was headed west from the location of the paper mill towards the accident site.
As to the cause of that accident that day, there's no doubt in my mind that the industrial fog created by water emissions from that Bowater paper mill was a major factor, the major factor, preponderantly major factor in forming the fog that caused the accident.
Attorney Doug Fees now had scientific evidence and proceeded with the civil suit he filed earlier against the Bowater Paper Company and the state of Tennessee. As Mike Curtis drove onto Interstate 75 on the morning of the accident, the sun was so strong he took his jacket off in the car. When Curtis approached the fog zone, the fog warning lights in one direction weren't working, and those in the other direction had been blinking continuously for 3 days and were ignored. The daily police fog patrols had been abandoned years earlier. Once in the thick fog, visibility was near zero. Mike Curtis never saw what he hit. Curtis heard crashes, people crying for help, the explosions.
I knelt down and asked God to help me to get through it.
He helped a young boy caught inside a motorhome.
12 or 13-year-old boy that I got out. His mother was inside screaming. The adrenaline was pumping, and I ripped the window out and got her out.
After saving the boy and his mother, Curtis tried to save the father, but he burned to death. There was also tragedy for a woman driving with her granddaughter. This is all that was left of the car.
This car was smashed completely flat like an accordion.
The car was compacted down to something in the neighborhood of 30 inches long. By some miracle, this little girl lived through the entire thing.
The grandmother died. Randall McKeon and his 2 children also suffered a loss that day. They lost a wife and mother when Judith McKeon burned to death in the accident.
There wasn't no body. She was over 90% gone. It was like she'd been cremated. And there wasn't nothing to view. She still had remains, ashes, which I'm not saying could be identified, but still knowing that she died in that vehicle. I did the best I could to get everything of all the ashes out. And I spread them across that field right out there. And I guess that was the only thing I knew to do.
Doug Fee's case was set for trial in 1994, more than 3 years after the accident. Bowater disagreed with the scientific calculations used in the Eschenroder study and hired its own scientific expert. Dr. George McVeal is a meteorologist from Denver. His study concluded that Bowater's contribution to the fog on the day of the accident was less than 1%.
Our conclusion was that the fog formed by a natural process due to mixing of moist air at different altitudes at about 9 o'clock on the morning of December 11th, after the sun had come up and heated the ground enough to start the mixing process. And that, in a very abbreviated and simplified form, is what caused the fog on that morning.
But shortly before the trial, the courts ordered Bowater to release a study it commissioned in 1979 from its own consulting firm, Environmental Research and Technology. In it, ERT states that preliminary evidence suggests that Bowater operations contribute to local vapor flux and fogging problems in the Calhoun area. Doug Fees never got the chance to prove his case in court. Before the trial, the state of Tennessee reached an out-of-court settlement with Fees on behalf of the families he represented. Because of the malfunctioning fog warning system, the state settled for $800,000 and also agreed to install a $4 million computerized fog detection system. When the fog reaches a certain density, large signs automatically notify drivers of fog in the area, and sensors trigger gates on key entrance ramps closing access to the highway. Bowater also settled out of court with 30 victims and families represented by Doug Fees and other attorneys for $11 million. Bowater continues to maintain that the paper mill and treatment ponds had nothing to do with the fog on the day of the accident. However, Bowater agreed to limit its use of treatment pond number 4, which sits near the highway.
But the issue isn't whether or not Pond 4 is a contributor to fog, whether natural water conditions that are in the community are contributors to fog. The real point is that fog exists in that particular place from time to time. It's natural fog, and the traffic control mechanisms on the highway have to be sufficient to warn motorists.
Despite the settlement and the new fog warning system, many still believe the highway is unsafe.
Warnings are never the answer when you can do better. Closure of Pond 4 is not enough to solve the problem. The chance of this happening again has been substantially reduced, but the risk has not been eliminated, nor has the hazard been eliminated.
This is only the 3rd time I've been here. It's, and any officer will tell you that, you know, this is to me, it's a memorial site. That bridge is a memorial, because a lot of people died here, needlessly.
While Earl Morris was vacationing in California, he learned his wife had been reported missing from their home in Arizona.
What? Mom's missing? What happened?
The search for Ruby Morris involved dozens of police investigators, forensic scientists, DNA testing, and even the Coast Guard.
I'm heading home.
The results of that investigation surprised everyone, especially Earl Morris. Ruby and Earl Morris were partners in both business and in marriage. They had been married for over 20 years and were the parents of 3 grown children. The Morrises were both accountants and operated their own accounting and tax preparation firm.
They had had it for years and years, and they built it up, together from scratch, and it was doing very well.
Their business made them millionaires, and they raised their 3 children in this luxurious mountain home just outside of Phoenix. On June 4th, 1989, Earl Morris headed to California to see his oldest daughter, Donna Kay, perform in a concert. She was a country singer with a promising career. Ruby decided not to join her husband on that trip, planning instead to go shopping with her other daughter, Cindy, for some furniture for her new home. But Ruby didn't show up on Sunday morning at Cindy's home for the planned shopping trip. So Cindy drove out to her parents' home.
That's totally unlike her mom. I mean, her mother kept every, date that she ever had with her, and unless she called her and canceled, then she didn't do this.
Ruby Morris wasn't home. The burglar alarm was turned off. Ruby's pocketbook was missing, but her car was still there, although it wasn't parked in its usual spot. Ruby Morris was a neat, meticulous person, and her daughter noticed right away that things were out of place. A faucet was dripping in the bathtub. Dirty clothes were piled high inside the washing machine and hadn't been washed. A carpet shampoo cleaner was left out, but the most troubling discovery was that a .22 caliber pistol usually kept in a closet was missing. Cindy Morris immediately called the police.
And that's really all I expected it to be, was another missing persons case that this person would be found in a couple of hours.
When Earl Morris heard the news of his wife's disappearance, he told family members that he would head straight home from California. If Cindy Morris was right, and something happened to her mother, investigators hoped to find some clues to her whereabouts inside the Morris home. It took Earl Morris longer than anticipated to drive home from California, but when he arrived, the police were anxious to speak with him.
So have you ever had any fights?
Earl Morris told police that their relationship was basically a good one with occasional arguments, but nothing out of the ordinary.
She ever done anything at all like this before? I mean, left and just...
Yeah, she's done it before, but she usually calls, or gets mad or something.
Morris also confirmed that the .22 caliber pistol the couple owned was not in the closet where he last saw it.
We were going in several different directions with this, that the possibility of that she was missing, possibility of a suicide, possibility of a homicide.
The car broke down.
Earl Morris told police that his car broke down on the drive home from California and that he rented a car to complete the trip. But Detective Lugenbuehl noticed something suspicious when he looked inside the trunk of the rental car. Attached to Earl's suitcase was an airline luggage tag for a recent flight from San Diego to Phoenix. A search of the passenger list from that flight did not include the name of Earl Morris, although there was a G. Norris listed. Police put together a group of photographs, including one of Earl Morris, and showed it to the airline crew members to see if anyone recalled seeing Earl on that flight. One of the flight attendants remembered him distinctly because of the poor quality of his toupee. Faced with this inconsistency, detectives decided to search the Morris home further to see if there was any evidence of foul play which might have been overlooked during their first visit.
So what we did is we called in our ID techs to give us a hand, and we asked them to do luminol.
Determined, because of the distribution, the shape, and the size of the droplets, that it was high velocity from gunshot.
Only a bullet produces a fine mist of blood similar to that found on the headboard. A beating or stabbing produces a much different blood spatter pattern. On the surface of the mattress, they found tiny blood stains, and they also found blood inside the mattress itself. Next, investigators sprayed luminol in the bathroom.
The entire shower stall lit up, basically, with the luminol.
Luminol tests also revealed blood on the cement patio outside the master bedroom, as well as on the master bedroom carpet.
We noticed that the whole bedroom floor, which was carpeted, started to glow.
And we knew that from what we were seeing that we did have a violent crime scene, maybe not a death, but somebody had suffered some pretty good injuries at that point.
But detectives had no idea to whom the blood belonged. To find out, scientists conducted a DNA test on the blood stain. The results of that test shocked everyone. A deep, dark family secret would soon be revealed. Scientists can tell whether the blood stain would have come from a parent.
In the case of children, 50% of the DNA from each child will come from one parent, and the other 50% will come from the other parent. So this obligated inheritance of DNA from the mother to children is one of the important factors that we are looking for in conducting this analysis.
Since children get half of their DNA from their mother and the other half from their father, a DNA profile of the children and from one of the parents can give scientists enough genetic information to identify the DNA profile of the other parent, even without a blood sample. If the DNA profile of the missing parent matches the DNA profile of the blood stain, scientists will then analyze the DNA from a missing person's siblings to confirm their findings. When scientists compared Cindy Morris's DNA to the DNA from the bloodstain, they found one matching band. They also found one matching band when comparing the DNA profile of Ruby's brother to the bloodstain.
It's highly probable that those bloodstains came from Ruby Morris.
But scientists noticed something peculiar. When they compared Earl Morris's DNA to the DNA profile of his daughter, Cindy, there were no matching bands. Earl Morris was not Cindy's biological father. When they compared Earl Morris's DNA to his oldest child, Randy, they discovered the same thing. Earl was not Randy's biological father either. Randy's DNA matched that of his grandfather, his mother's father. When law enforcement authorities in Tennessee learned of these DNA results, Ruby's father was charged with incest. According to the DNA tests, Ruby's father had sex with her when she was just 15 years old.
Well, we had a surprise. We felt that perhaps the family would be surprised by it, and that Earl Morris himself was surprised by it.
The Morris children had another family secret to reveal. They admitted that their mother had been depressed recently since she learned her husband Earl was having an affair with her sister, Peggy. In fact, Ruby and her daughter, Cindy, once caught the two together at the Phoenix airport when Peggy secretly flew to Phoenix to meet with Earl. Ruby confronted Earl about the affair, but he reportedly refused to end it.
Also looking at Peggy, the sister. She had motive and opportunity to be involved in this too. She lived in Louisiana at the time, but we discovered that she had a planned vacation going to San Diego that weekend. We discovered phone calls that Earl had made to her.
Peggy admitted to police that she had planned to meet Earl in San Diego shortly after Ruby disappeared, but missed her flight. But police knew Earl had been in San Diego, not only because of the baggage claim tag on his suitcase, but they also found his car in the airport parking lot. The car appeared to be clean. But when luminol was applied to the inside of the vehicle, the floor of the passenger side revealed a huge blood stain. So much blood that the individual it came from would almost certainly be dead. A DNA analysis of the blood in the car revealed that it matched the blood stain found in the Morris's bedroom, which scientists concluded belonged to Ruby.
We didn't know where the body was. We didn't know if he would transport the body to San Diego. Why would he transport it down there? We had no real clue.
The clue was here in a San Diego marina. The Morrises owned a boat which was stored there. Marina employees told police that Earl Morris was at the marina on June 5th and had taken the boat for a ride. When police went to search the boat, they discovered it was missing. The Coast Guard was asked to help locate the missing boat, and they told police about a mysterious fire on a boat about the same size which burned and sank 13 miles offshore from the San Diego marina. This is actual footage of the fire taken by a television news crew.
There were no survivors, no people anywhere in sight. The first thing that was unusual was the way it burned. It burned pretty much from the center out, and normally the fire's starting either in the engine room or in the fuel compartment. And it just looked very suspect right from the beginning. So the things that stood out with the fact that there was like a lantern right in the middle of the boat, right on top of the melted fiberglass, which looked like somebody had thrown it there and possibly started a fire.
Records indicated that Earl Morris rented a small boat on the morning of June 5th and returned it around 12 noon, about the same time the Coast Guard discovered the burning boat. It was beginning to appear that the body of Ruby Morris was on that burning boat which sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But prosecutors believed that they still had enough evidence to prove Ruby Morris had been murdered.
You start building all of those together, then what you have is Ruby Morris's blood, Ruby Morris's bed, Ruby Morris with a high-velocity gunshot wound that killed her in her bed at her home. Who was there? Earl Morris.
Earl Morris was charged with the murder of his wife, Ruby, but the case was far from over. Investigators were in for another big surprise. Earl Morris's defense would be a challenge for forensic science. In 1991, Earl Morris went on trial for the murder of his wife. The prosecution first had to convince the jury that a murder had taken place since there was no body.
We had to build the case from scratch. We had to prove a corpus delicti, that in fact a murder had occurred, without the physical evidence for someone to look at.
According to the prosecution, Earl Morris entered the master bedroom early on Saturday morning, June 4th. He dragged her body into an adjacent bathroom, removed her clothing, and put her into the bathtub to remove the blood. He then dressed her body in a jogging suit, covered her head wound with a baseball cap, and carried the body to the garage. Since his car didn't have a trunk, he had no choice but to place the body into the passenger side of the front seat. Earl then cleaned all of the blood from inside the house, from the headboard, the bathtub, the carpets, all later revealed by the luminol. Earl began his journey to San Diego, driving nearly 400 miles with his wife's body in the seat next to him. blood continued to drip from the head wound, falling to the floor beneath the seat, later discovered by the luminol test. Earl stopped once for gas, and no one noticed that his passenger was dead. When Morris arrived in San Diego, he towed his boat to the launch. And in broad daylight, placed Ruby's body on the boat along with some of the bloody sheets and the murder weapon. He also took along a lantern and some gasoline. After renting a smaller boat, he set off to sea, towing the rented boat behind. 13 miles offshore in the Pacific Ocean, Earl Morris prepared the boat for destruction, hoping to bury not only his wife's body, but all of the remaining evidence of his involvement. After dousing the boat with gasoline, he stepped into the rental boat, lit the lantern, and threw it onto the deck. He left before being spotted by the Coast Guard. Sometime after Morris left the scene, a news crew captured these pictures while the boat was still on fire, minutes before it sank. Neither Ruby Morris nor the boat was ever recovered. During the trial, Earl Morris delivered a surprising defense. He admitted that his wife was dead and that her body was indeed on the boat that burned and sank. Morris also admitted to setting the fire and sinking the boat. But Earl Morris insisted he did not kill his wife. He said she committed suicide because of guilt and depression, guilt over the fact that her husband wasn't the father of 2 of their children, and depression about Earl's affair with her sister Peggy.
My first thoughts were that I would be blamed for Ruby committing suicide.
After you had those thoughts, did you make any decisions?
Yes, I did.
What decisions did you make?
To hide the fact with what she'd done.
Up until that point in time, we had circumstantial evidence that she was dead. No one to say, I saw Ruby Morris's body. No one to say, I saw Ruby Morris injured. No one to say, I saw the shooting, I heard the shooting.
Patterns going at 2 different angles that are not, you cannot create that in one shot.
And a person committing suicide does not shoot twice to the head. The jury saw Earl Morris's last-minute claim of suicide as just one more lie. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life.
He dropped traces of Ruby Morris, and that was Ruby Morris on the floor, that was Ruby Morris in the El Camino, that was Ruby Morris in the bed that was saying, this is what happened. That was our read on it. So Ruby Morris was actually telling us what happened to her.
No body, no gun, no confession. The science gave us Ruby Morris and gave us the corpus delicti. If it had not been for the blood in the car and the DNA testing, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. Earl Morris would be a free man.
As Peggy Carr lay ill in a hospital intensive care unit, doctors were baffled.
Take a deep breath for me now.
Lab tests were all negative, but one of the doctors noticed a tiny clue. Her hair was falling out. It was a symptom of a very rare condition, one the doctor had never seen before. And if he was right, there was no known cure. Peggy Carr was a 41-year-old restaurant worker who had been married to her second husband, Pye, for the last 6 months. Peggy worked as a waitress at a drive-in restaurant and had 3 children from a previous marriage. Pye had 2 children and worked at a phosphate mine.
They seemed to be happy. My mom loved him more than anything. You know, he was just the light of her life. You know, he was it.
But soon after their marriage, Peggy began to question the long hours Pye was working at the mine.
He worked all the time. There were some questions about if he was really at work or if he was out.
One night when Pye said he was working late, Peggy drove out to the mine. In the parking lot, she saw only 2 cars. One was Pye's. The other belonged to one of his former girlfriends.
My mom went out to where he worked, and we found him with another woman.
When I guess she found out that he was cheating, things started, going downhill.
When Peggy learned of the affair, she took her children to a nearby motel and left her husband a note.
Dear Pye, I'm going to give you some time to think about us. I can't live like we have been. I can't imagine living without you, but I can if you don't want me. I love you with all my heart. Peggy.
After a brief separation, the couple resolved their differences and Peggy and her children moved back home. On the day she returned, Pye left for a previously scheduled hunting trip. While he was away, Peggy became ill, complaining of an upset stomach and an intense burning sensation. When Pye returned home, he told the children he thought it was only a virus.
She was sick. She was very sick. She was laying in bed and she couldn't move. She kept complaining of her hands and her feet. She said she couldn't open her eyes. She was nauseated.
By the time Peggy was taken to the hospital, doctors noticed some weakness in both sides of her face. But when lab tests were negative and they couldn't diagnose her problem, Peggy was released.
The next day I went up to check on her and she was even worse. And I told Pye, I said, we need to take her to the hospital again because she's not getting any better. Well, he went to work.
The children drove her to the hospital once again. This time, one of the physicians who examined her noticed a tiny clue.
I noticed that her hair, simply raising her up off the pillow to listen to her back, quite a bit of her hair was left on the pillow.
Dr. Robert Van Hook and his colleagues thought it might be a poison, a very rare one, which doesn't show up in normal lab tests. A special test confirmed his suspicion. It was thallium poisoning. Thallium is a highly toxic metal, widely used as a pesticide before it was banned in the United States in 1972. Once inside the body, thallium attacks nerve endings and muscles, causing them to atrophy and die. In severe cases, it can cause delirium, paralysis, coma, even death. Tests reveal that Peggy had 50 times the maximum human exposure in her system, and there is no known cure or antidote. Within days, Peggy's stepson Travis and son Dwayne were hospitalized as well. They too had thallium poisoning.
Where it was like somebody taking 1,000 needles, putting your feet in them and just pressing all at once. And real painful, something that you just couldn't, let go.
How did Peggy Carr and the two boys ingest such large amounts of thallium? Was it accidental, or was someone trying to kill them? Since there is no cure or antidote for thallium poisoning, Peggy Carr's condition grew progressively worse. After losing all of her hair, she slipped into a coma. Health officials frantically searched for the source of the thallium. The orange grove next to the Carr's home was tested to determine whether thallium had been sprayed on the orange trees. And the drinking water well in the area was also tested, but thallium wasn't found. Next, health officials gathered air and dust samples from inside the Carr's home and took more than 400 household items for laboratory analysis. Friends told police that the family received an anonymous threatening letter just a few months earlier. It was addressed to Pye Carr, misspelling Pye's name.
You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you all die. This is no joke.
Police were suspicious of Pye Carr, not only because he failed to mention the threatening letter, but also because of his extramarital affair, the fact that he was away when Peggy first got sick, and his hesitation in taking Peggy to the hospital.
We dug very deeply at that point into Pye Carr's background, anything that would show motivation on his part to poison his wife.
We thought, Pye had something to do with it, because the way he was acting so strange, he was always so secretive. It's like he always had something to hide.
All of the remaining family members were asked to undergo thallium testing as well, just as a precaution. And the results were surprising. Peggy's daughter Sissy and her child Casey both had traces of thallium in their systems. And so did Pye. The only family member found not to have thallium in her system was Pye's daughter Tammy. When the laboratory analyzed the items from the Carr's home, they found the source of the thallium in some empty soda bottles. Detectives returned to the Carr home and found 3 full bottles from the same carton. The FBI found no fingerprints on the full bottles recovered from the Carr's home. But under a scanning electron microscope, magnified 100 times, the FBI discovered tiny scratch marks on the caps, an indication that they had been meticulously removed and replaced. Using a process called flame atomic absorption spectroscopy, the soda produced a distinctive greenish color to the flame, a positive indication that thallium was present. Tests revealed that each of the 3 bottles contained more than 1 gram of thallium, enough to kill an adult. Thallium causes drinks to overflow, alters the color, and produces a noticeable sediment on the bottom. But the mixture found in the soda avoided these problems, and was a mixture which will not be revealed in this program. The FBI knew this was not the work of an amateur. The sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, the professional removal and reattachment of the bottle caps told the FBI that the killer was very smart, very organized, and would be very difficult to catch. When Peggy Carr slipped into a coma, her doctors had little, if any, hope for her recovery. Her son and stepson were both in serious condition, but expected to recover. Pye's daughter Tammy was the only family member without thallium in her system. She told police she didn't drink the soda because she consumed only diet drinks. And when thallium was found in Pi's system, he was no longer considered a suspect. With no other leads, the FBI was asked to provide a psychological profile of the poisoner. The profiling unit believed that the poisoner was highly intelligent, a white male in his mid-30s who resolves conflict without direct confrontation. He liked to read about murder, watch violent movies, and would then fantasize about committing murder.
It's more of a passive type of person, and it's more of a cowardly type of crime. You don't have to look the intended victim in the eye. It's very similar to a bomber. Very similar.
Was poisoned.
She was cussing, ranting and raving about my two brothers having music on in the front yard, telling them to turn it down.
My mom had enough of this lady, you know, yelling at her, screaming at her, cussing at her, so she turned around and walked off, said, "I'm done talking with you now."
She says, "This ain't over yet. This ain't over yet."
A background check revealed that Trepal had been arrested in North Carolina in the mid-70s for running one of the largest methamphetamine labs in the eastern United States. The drug agent who arrested Trepal called him the smartest chemist he had ever known. On March 3rd, 1989, 4 months after she was poisoned, Peggy Carr died. It was now a murder investigation. The Sheriff's Department assigned Special Agent Susan Gorick to the case. She was asked to go undercover to infiltrate the Mensa group to which George Trepal and Diana Carr belonged, an experience she vividly described in her best-selling book, Poison Mind. Under an assumed name and identity, Susan Gorick attended a Mensa murder mystery weekend which George and his wife Diana were hosting.
Before I went to the weekend, I spoke with the people up at the FBI Behavioral Science Unit to see if I could get some tips on the type of person or type of personality that I should develop if I was to meet George Trepal.
When Gorick arrived for the weekend, she received a copy of the murder scenarios George Trepal wrote for the participants. One was a murder by poisoning.
Few voodooists believe that they can be killed by psychic means, but no one doubts that he can be poisoned.
Susan Gorick accomplished her mission that weekend when George Trepal befriended her.
He's very intelligent, maybe a little eccentric. A lot of people would call him odd, but because I spent so much time with him, I got to know him, and I did see a good side of him. I did see a nice personality, but I also saw a very evil side.
Oh yeah, somebody got poisoned next door.
In her undercover role, always under surveillance, Gorick met with Trepal on numerous occasions, hoping to gather evidence of his involvement in the poisonings. Their relationship led to the type found in the soda bottles in the Carr home.
We had a lot of circumstantial evidence, but this was the only piece of real evidence that you could actually put your hands on.
The police then searched Trepal's new home and discovered a notebook George captioned, "General Poisoning Guides." Inside were excerpts from books used by homicide detectives. One was Death by Poison. Another listed details of the uses and effects of thallium. George Trepal was arrested for the murder of Peggy Carr and the attempted murder of the entire Carr family.
Police believe that George Trepal grew annoyed with his neighbors, especially the children. When the threatening letter failed to scare the family away, Trepal took a more direct approach. He took his tea soda and carefully removed all of the bottle caps with special tools. His chemical knowledge led him to choose a poison which had no cure or antidote, one that couldn't be detected by conventional medical tests. It was hauntingly similar to the plot he would later write for the murder mystery weekly. When death then appears in the doorstep, two people throw out their food and watch it eat. Most others on the doorstep are seriously saying, I don't like you. Room for us. The Carr family remembers drinking soda at a family dinner when they had fried chicken. Ty Carr was drinking bourbon and added a splash of soda from one of the bottles. Ty's daughter, Tammy, was drinking diet soda. She was the only family member who wasn't poisoned. Becky most likely ingested more soda than the others because she had the highest fatty levels. After she was hospitalized, her condition deteriorated. She slipped into a coma and died 4 months later. The two boys were also hospitalized with recovery.
I would say that this one case was about being able to find lethality and washings, empty bottles. When Coca-Cola did the experiments, that was extremely compelling. The science of the FBI lab, if you pick up those bottle caps, you can't possibly, I don't think with a magnifying glass, find those tumors. And yet, they're so obvious that they run out pictures of the FBI. Another thing very important about the science is George's knowledge of the science and the amount of literature found in his house that backed it up.
When Powell went on trial in 1991, the case against him was largely circumstantial. Powell's criminal history as head chemist for an illegal methamphetamine lab. The fact that he used similar phraseology in an interview with the police that was used in the threatening letter. His authorship of the murder mystery storyline dealing with both a poisoning and a threatening letter. The bottle with thallium found in his workshed, and the books with information on the use of thallium found in his home.
The whole case is circumstantial. That was my whole closing argument. And the way that we approached it because of that was to exclude every other person on Social Security.
The defense argued there was no proof that Powell purchased the soda. His fingerprints were not found on the soda bottles or on the vial of thallium. His lawyer also suggested that there was reasonable doubt. All of the evidence could also point to Powell's wife, Diana, who had a master's degree in chemistry. It took the jury just 6 hours to reach a verdict. George T. Powell was found guilty of all charges, and he was sentenced to death.
I couldn't believe it. I honestly didn't believe it, because the man that I knew, was the man I moved his driveway, because it was 2 foot off of our property line. I mowed his driveway. He always waved at me. He was weird. He was a nerd. I heard he was a chemical freak or whatever. But he didn't seem capable of murder. Not in my eyes.
He did the most horrible act that I've ever seen in my investigative. At the end of his act, he killed one person, that person tortured him for death.
She was really nice. She was my only one at my baby. She was the only one I kept for a long time. My dad wasn't always there. She always was.
In a quiet English village, a few hours' drive from London, a threat was delivered to a local farmer. Impaled on a fence post, a severed lamb's head, along with the message, "You next." The note said little about its author, but between the lines, it said plenty. Nestled among the lush rolling hills of England's West Country is the tiny village of Horton, a cluster of houses lining one main street. A farming community where life is simple, quiet, and peaceful. But in the spring of 1984, the peace and quiet was shattered following a series of bizarre events that took place here at Widden Hill Farm. 44-year-old Graham Backhouse and his wife Margaret lived at the farm with their 2 children. Backhouse had inherited the farm from his father, but by all accounts, Backhouse, a former hairdresser, was not having financial success as a farmer.
He had to take over the farm. He had no option in the business. And there was a pretty obvious that he was a kind of reluctant, grudging farmer. But it was well known that the farm was not making money.
On March 30th, 1984, Backhouse reported a grisly and terrifying discovery. A severed lamb's head had been impaled on his fence post, placed next to it a note warning in large handwritten letters, "You next." Backhouse told police that this wasn't the first time threats had been made against him.
He told me that he was receiving telephone calls of a threatening nature, even threats to kill, as I recall.
Backhouse also told police about a threatening letter he had received in the mail,
which said words to the effect, "You have ruined my sister's life. I'm going to get you, you bastard."
Less than 2 weeks later, the threats turned violent. Margaret Backhouse was heading into town to do some shopping. She decided to take her husband's car because her car was having some mechanical difficulties. Graham was in the barn and never heard the explosion or Margaret's screams for help over the music from his radio. The bomb was unsophisticated but extremely powerful. It had been planted directly under the driver's seat.
Strictly speaking, it wasn't a bomb. It was a shortened version of a shotgun. It was constructed from a galvanized steel pipe, 2-inch diameter, quite a thick wall to the pipe.
Margaret Backhouse survived the explosion because the force of the bomb was directed downwards by the high-quality construction of the driver's seat. But doctors still had to remove more than a pound of pellets and shrapnel from Margaret Backhouse's body. The bombing stunned villagers who now had to accept the fact that the threats against Graham Backhouse were serious.
When bombs go off, you've got to take it seriously. And people were thinking that there must be something behind this. It was the only possible conclusion that we all reached, that the bomb must have been for Graham Backhouse.
But who wanted Graham Backhouse dead, and why? On the same day of the car bomb explosion which seriously injured Margaret Backhouse, a threatening letter was delivered to the Backhouse farm.
And the message said something to the effect, "Came twice last week, but the pigs were about."
The note ended with the words, "See you soon." The words "twice" and "were" had both been misspelled, and experts believed that the spelling errors were deliberate. Investigators also examined the note found beside the severed lamb's head, the one which stated, "You next." An analysis of that note revealed a possible clue, an impression from a circular doodle. When a doodle is made on a piece of paper, the pressure from the writing instrument leaves an impression on the pages underneath the original doodle. Doodle impressions can be found using a technique called oblique lighting, which casts shadows across the indentations of the paper.
So that you can see the impression as a row of shadows, and these can then be photographed.
Police asked Graham Backhouse to identify all individuals who may have wanted to harm him.
He was interviewed at some length about who his enemies were, who his ex-girlfriends were, and things of that nature.
Backhouse told police about one possibility. A former quarry worker named David Hodkinson. Backhouse said he once had a sexual affair with Hodkinson's wife. Hodkinson would have had access to explosives and was also an electrician who specialized in wiring automobiles.
On the day the explosion took place, this person was in fact out of the country on holiday and had been out of the country for 3 or 4 days beforehand.
When Hodkinson's alibi checked out, police turned their attention to one of Graham Backhouse's neighbors, Colin Bedale Taylor. He was a retired engineer, seriously depressed over the death of his 19-year-old son Digby, who died in a car crash 2 years earlier. Bedale Taylor and Backhouse were involved in a bitter land dispute which they couldn't seem to resolve. They lived 200 yards apart. Colin Bedale Taylor was well liked in the small farming community. He was a woodworker and handyman who built this bench for his friends in the village with the words, "Bide a while," inscribed on the backrest. Despite the differences between Backhouse and Bedale Taylor, police did not seriously consider him a suspect in the car bombing.
There was no reason to suspect that Mr. Bedale Taylor was in any way, shape or form involved in this incident.
With no other leads, Backhouse and his family were given 24-hour police protection immediately following the bombing. After a week, Graham Backhouse began to resent the police intrusion and asked them to end the around-the-clock protection. Before they left, police installed an alarm button connecting the Backhouse home directly to the police station. Just 2 weeks later, the alarm sounded.
Police cars began streaming up the hill. We knew that something was seriously wrong.
When the police arrived at the farm, they saw a horrific scene of blood and death. Blood was found on the kitchen floor. The chairs had been overturned. And at the bottom of the stairs at the end of a hallway lay the body of Colin Bedale Taylor, Backhouse's neighbor. He had been shot twice in the chest. In his right hand, firmly clutched, was a Stanley knife inscribed with his own initials, CBT. Backhouse was bleeding profusely with gaping slash wounds on his face and chest.
Well, let's pop in to see how your wife is faring.
She's doing very well.
He told police that Bedale Taylor stopped by to ask how his wife was doing in the hospital following the car bombing.
Justice?
Without warning, Colin flew into a rage and attacked Backhouse with a Stanley knife.
Me that set the bomb in your car. You should have been the victim, not her!
He said he was doing God's work, blamed Backhouse for the death of his son, and admitted planting the car bomb. Backhouse ran to the hallway, grabbed his shotgun, and shot Bedale Taylor in self-defense. Police roped off the farm and called for forensic detectives to conduct an examination. They were particularly interested in the blood trails, the one they could see and the one they couldn't find. Graham Backhouse told police that he killed Colin Bedale Taylor in self-defense after his neighbor went berserk and attacked Backhouse with a Stanley knife. Backhouse said his neighbor admitted planting the car bomb and that it was intended for him, not his wife. When police searched Bedale Taylor's property, they found evidence linking him to the bombing.
We found a long section of pipe on grounds quite close to Colin Beadle Taylor's home, and this matched the remnants of the bomb that were reconstructed.
The obvious implication was that the pipe bomb had been made by him and come from his land.
But forensic detectives were confused by what they found at the scene of the attack. First, the blood spatter on the kitchen floor told a story, but it was a story inconsistent with Backhouse's version of events.
The staining was predominantly in the form of small, circular drips of blood.
The circular drops of blood found on the kitchen floor were not consistent with a struggle, but indicated that the blood dripped from an individual standing still.
Blood dripping vertically to a surface during a passive act of bleeding will form circular spots or stains. But if we have a violent movement of the body, the flicking of the hand, see a different shape of stain. They're more elongated, and some of the stains will show a tail shape to them, pointing in the direction of travel that the blood impacted the surface.
And there was something missing. Backhouse said he ran for his life from the kitchen down the hall to get his gun. But police could find no trail of blood.
We seem to have a man who was dripping blood profusely in the kitchen, manages to move over 15 foot of carpeted hallway without leaving any drips of blood.
And police were faced with another discrepancy. Backhouse said he shot Bedale Taylor after his face and chest had been slashed, but his blood was not found on the gun. Had he been attacked before firing the gun, blood from his face wound or from his hands would have dripped onto the gun as he fired in self-defense.
So both features missing from the gun suggested that he wasn't bleeding and hadn't blood staining on him at the time that he picked up that gun.
The victim was found clutching the Stanley knife firmly in his right hand. The forensic pathologist found this highly unusual.
When somebody's shot, or when somebody dies, they go limp. So then I would expect to see the response, or the body's response to being shot twice in the chest, and death taking place simply to relax, and the knife would fall from the hand. It wouldn't be clutched tightly in the hand.
And Bedale Taylor's right palm was bloody. When an individual holds a knife during an attack, the knife usually prevents blood from staining the entire palm.
There's an area of the palm which is either very lightly stained with blood or not stained with blood. The knife protects that part of the palm.
Backhouse's chest wound was also inconsistent with the struggle.
Because normally, if you're cut, you withdraw. Your body jerks away. So how on earth are you going to get a wound which then travels almost half the circumference of the chest? In a one-to-one confrontation, I would never expect to see that pattern of injury.
And Backhouse had no defensive injuries commonly found when a person fends off a knife attack.
They actually grab hold of the weapon itself, and they get cuts across their fingers and the palm. And sometimes you find that they've tried to block the weapon, put their hand up, and they get cuts in the back of the forearm, or the side of the forearm, or on the back of the hand. None of these were present here.
And there was something else, something small, but significant. When police searched Backhouse's study, they found a notepad. On one of the pages was a circular doodle. The ink doodle found on Backhouse's notepad was identical to the impression found on the U next note.
It was a whole series of circles, quite a complicated thing. The impressions were quite deep so that you had a good photograph and you were able to get a good alignment, and you could see clearly that it came from this doodle. It was exactly the same, there was no doubt whatsoever about it. This is the doodle that we're talking about here. You can see just various scribble. When we turn the page, I think you can still see the impression. This note is now very old and has been well handled, so it's not terribly clear now, but it is still there. Just see it there. Still see the impression just there.
Proof that the "You Next" note was written on Graham Backhouse's own notepad.
We now had a document in the form of the "You Next" note that we could positively link with Widdenhill Farm.
Police believed they could now piece together the bizarre events which led to the cold-blooded murder of Colin Bedale Taylor. After 2 straight years of crop failures, Graham Backhouse was £50,000 in debt to a local bank and was in desperate need of funds. Backhouse devised an elaborate scheme to get out of debt once and for all. His plan was to kill his wife and collect on her life insurance policies, which he had recently doubled to £100,000. But he wanted the murder to appear as if Margaret had been killed by someone out to kill him. So Backhouse fabricated the story about the threatening phone calls and letters. Backhouse himself wrote the "You Next" note and impaled the severed lamb's head on his fence post, establishing the ruse that someone was out to get him. With the stage now set, Backhouse turned his attention to the murder of his wife. He planted a pipe bomb under the driver's seat of his own car. He knew his wife would drive his car into town the next morning because her car was having mechanical problems. But Backhouse never expected his wife to survive the explosion. Desperate and fearing the police would consider him a suspect, Backhouse panicked and decided to set up a scapegoat, someone to divert the police inquiry from himself. The logical choice was his neighbor, Colin Bedale Taylor.
I'm fine.
Thanks for coming about the furniture.
Villagers knew that the two were involved in a land dispute. When Bedale Taylor accepted Graham's invitation to discuss a piece of furniture, he had no way of knowing he had walked into a death trap.
Going?
Colin was shot twice in the chest in cold blood. To make the shooting appear to be in self-defense, Backhouse slashed himself in the face and chest with a knife he had inscribed with his neighbor's initials. Bleeding profusely from the self-inflicted wounds, Backhouse overturned kitchen chairs to make it appear there had been a struggle, never realizing the shape of the blood spatter would indicate no struggle at all. Backhouse's own blood was found on the victim's shirt because he stood directly over the body when he placed the knife in the dead man's hand. With the crime scene now complete, Graham Backhouse called the police. Sometime earlier, Backhouse planted a piece of pipe on Bedale Taylor's property, identical to the type used in making the car bomb. When the forensic evidence contradicted Backhouse's version of events, he was arrested for both the attempted murder of his wife and the murder of Colin Bedale Taylor. In addition to the blood spatter evidence, the doodle impression found on Backhouse's notepad, and the medical examiner's opinion that the cuts on Graham Backhouse were self-inflicted, another crucial piece of evidence helped seal the case. It came from the letter delivered to the Backhouse farm on the day of the bombing. Forensic detectives wanted to analyze the glued envelope for saliva, hoping to determine the blood type of the individual who sent the letter, but they discovered much more. Under the microscope, the fiber found in the envelope matched fibers found in a brown cardigan sweater owned by Graham Backhouse. Further proof that Backhouse had mailed the threatening letter to himself. Graham Backhouse's plotting continued from his prison cell. He conned a fellow prisoner into smuggling out an unsigned letter to a local newspaper. The letter implicated Colin Bedale Taylor in the car bombing, but the letter was confiscated, and Backhouse's handwriting matched the handwriting on the letter delivered to the farm on the day of the bombing. After a 16-day trial, Graham Backhouse was convicted of all charges against him and received 2 life sentences.
If somebody had set out to write a novel along those lines, it would never have been accepted by anybody. I mean, this is absolutely truth being stranger than fiction.
This was an outstanding case in many respects, principally because without forensic evidence, there was no case.
The worst aspect was, of course, the fact that he picked on a totally innocent man in the village and killed him for no other reason than to try to remove blame from himself. And that's what made it a diabolical murder.